Who's this lens for? You're an individual who would love to capture memories of yourself traveling or hiking or going to interesting places, or you're traveling with a group of friends or known people, acquaintances, or with your own family and kids. Capturing all the memories in terms of photos and videos. This lens is actually for you. A camera with interchangeable lenses. That means you can change the lenses for your camera. It's not a fixed lens to the camera. While using an interchangeable lens, a lot of times, we would love to go ahead and change our lenses. So you might actually have a lens for wide angle, you might actually have a lens for zoom range, and you might actually have a lens for, say, only portraits. Now, when you're actually out in the open, if your environment permits you, then it's good. You can change lenses and take photos. But what if the environment doesn't permit you? For example, you are at a beach along with your friends, and suddenly there is a little bit of wind out there. You would not like to change lenses when it's a little bit windy at a beach. The reason is pretty simple. You might actually get dust on your camera sensor. You do not want to have dust on your camera sensor. Although you can actually clean it, if you would like to avoid it, then you need something called as an ultra zoom lens. Now, ultra zoom lenses are actually a boon for someone who would love to capture memories in terms of photos and videos and want to less fiddle with the type of lens which is there on their camera. That means they would not like to change the lenses on the camera and are more interested in capturing the movements in terms of a photo or a video. Keeping up with that, for my particular scenario, I have gone ahead and actually invested in this Tamron 28-200mm f2.8 to f5.6 lens. This is an ultra zoom lens. Now, because I'm actually on a Sony E-mount system, I've gone ahead, put it up the extra money and bought a full frame lens. The advantage is I'll be able to use it not only on my A6700, but tomorrow if I want to use it on my A7 Mark IV, I'm happily able to use it. There is no need to worry about some kind of a cropping or vignetting actually in the corners. The advantage of using a full frame lens on my APS-C sensor A6700 is because the sensor is small and it's actually only there in the middle piece of it, most of the photos have a probability of having better sharpness when compared to having this lens on a full frame camera. You would get the camera along with a lens cap. Obviously, I've put a Hoya filter on top of it, a UV filter. You would also get it with a lens hood. What is it good at? As I was mentioning, this is an ultra zoom lens. That means this can actually give me a wider angle of around 28mm, and I can actually zoom in all the way up to 200mm and start shooting it. This is also called as a barrel zoom lens. That means when I'm actually zooming in, there is an extension of this barrel happens, and you have two tubes which are actually inside of the barrel protruding out. Now, although there are actually O-rings inside to make it actually a little bit of weather sealed, I would not actually use this even in mild rain or anything like that. The reason is pretty simple. It's because, you'll never know. You could actually have droplets fall in, slightly seep in. Just because on that particular day, your O-ring might actually have a small crack in it because you've opened and closed it in so many different times that the water might seep in and actually just destroy your lens. So I would normally not use it if it's raining or even a little bit heavily drizzling. Otherwise, in other atmospheres, it's perfectly fine to use. Even if it's a little bit windy or dusty, you can happily open up and use it. Just shake it up before you again zoom out and try to close this thing up. What you have on top of this is also a zoom lock. That means if you actually enable this, and you can see this red color here, then you'll not be able to zoom it. It's always preferable to have this lens in the lock mode when you're trying to transport this lens so that accidentally the zoom doesn't happen and the barrel is actually protruding. Now once you're actually trying to shoot, you can just unlock it and try to do it. Because it is red and no red, it's easy for you to find out whether your particular lens is actually in the lock condition or not, or you can just move this lens a little bit here and there. If it's in lock, it will absolutely not move. If it's unlocked, it will definitely move. Understanding the rings on this lens, the first thing up here is for focusing. It has a completely linear motion. It's soft, but it's a little bit dampened. So you cannot do rapid movements very harshly with your one hand. You'll be only able to do a little bit one at a time. So, it's slightly dampened, but it's also not that dampened that it's too heavy that you can't move it with one finger. As you can see, I'm just using my thumb to go ahead and actually rotate the focusing ring. The second ring or the outer ring from, lens mount side is basically your zoom. Now, in terms of zooming ranges, what you can see is the marked ones here are 28mm, 35, 50, 70, 100, 135 and 200 mm of full frame equivalent. Because this is a full frame lens, and generally in most of the lenses, normally you only have the full frame numbers being written. If you're using an APS-C sensor or a micro four thirds sensor, then you will actually have to use your crop factor, multiply with these numbers to get your full frame equivalent. Roughly between 42 all the way up to 350 mm full frame equivalent. That's how this particular camera lens would actually behave. The aperture value for this lens is from f2.8 to 5.6. That means at 28 millimeters, the minimum aperture value is f2.8, whereas at 200 millimeters, my minimum aperture value for this lens is 5.6. So the aperture is a variable aperture. That means whenever you're actually trying to zoom in and zoom out, because your minimum aperture value actually changes, so sometimes you'll actually have to change the composition of your exposure triangle. That means either you have to play with your ISO, or you have to go with your aperture value or your shutter speed to get a similar kind of actually framing happening. This sometimes becomes a bit difficulty when you're trying to shoot a video with zoom happening actually as part of it, right? That's the reason you actually have constant aperture lenses like my Sony 70 to 200mm f4, because you can always have constantly f4 across. This is not for that. But when I'm actually traveling, I'm going on a hike, I'm really not concerned about my aperture value changing, because whenever I try to zoom in, I first zoom in to the subject that I want to take a photograph of or take a video of. Then I would dial in my exposure triangle values of ISO, aperture and shutter speed to get the kind of photo or video that I'm actually expecting. So I'm not really worried about it. Typically your ultra zoom lenses would actually be of variable aperture. There are a couple of lenses of Tamron which vary a little bit less actually on aperture. That's somewhere between f2 to f2.8 if I'm not wrong. But that is almost like a 2,500 Australian dollar lens. I'm not going to spend that much on a travel lens. This lens that I've actually bought is roughly around 1,050 Australian dollars, which is roughly maybe 750 to 800 USD, which is a good value for money for a lens like this, because at a wider angle I can go down all the way up to f2.8, whereas when it's completely zoomed in, I really don't need f2.8. f5.6 is more than enough actually for me. So the good thing with Tamron lenses is, whether you're using its wide angle lenses, an ultra zoom lens or just a zoom lens, all of them are actually having a filter thread of 67 millimeters. You can get different type of mist filters, circular polarizers, as well as variable ND filters or just dedicated ND filters on this. If you'd like to see the filter kit that I'm having, please go ahead and comment below. I'll actually make a separate video on the filter kit and how it's actually impacting light and what kind of photo and video quality you're able to get on this. Now let's try to dwell a little bit more into the technical spec of this lens. As you can see from the Tamron's website, this particular lens is actually having 18 elements in 14 groups. So that means there are literally 18 glass elements inside the lens, and they are actually being distributed across in 14 different groups. And those 18 elements are allowing you to zoom anywhere between 28 millimeters all the way up to 200 millimeters. Not only that, it also has a magnification ratio. At the widest spot, that means at 28 millimeters, which is the widest spot, you would get a magnification factor of 1:3.1. Whereas at the entire telephoto end, that is at 200 millimeter end, you're getting a magnification factor of 1:3.8. What does that actually mean for you, right? So you can actually move closer to your subjects and take photos if you're doing some kind of a macro shooting. So what is the focusing distance when it comes to macro shooting, or how close you need to be to a subject so that you can actually focus on the subject and take a beautiful photo or a video? At wide angle, it's 0.19 meters. That is roughly 190 mm or 7.5 inches. Whereas at the telephoto end, that is at the 200 millimeter end, it is roughly 0.8 meters or around 31.5 inches. And let me show you some example of these images. So all these images were actually shot at 200 millimeters. Now these images are shot at 28 millimeters. These images are shot at 35 millimeters. These images are shot at 50 millimeters. These images are shot at 70 millimeters. These images are shot at 100 millimeters. And these images are shot at 135 millimeters. This lens from Tamron is designed in Japan but is actually manufactured in Vietnam. And its official model number is A071. And you have these markings on it called as DI3RXT. Now this, what it actually means, as per Tamron on their website, because it's a mouthful, I thought it's better I show you the website and then actually talk about it, right? The RXT on this lens basically stands for Rapid Extra Silent Stepping Drive. It's basically part of the autofocus drive system. It's powered by this technology wherein the stepping motor unit is supposed to deliver high speed, high precision performance. It is a moist resistant construction, obviously. I'm a bit unsure what the DI means. I'm hoping 3 is like revision 3, but RXT definitely is actually around autofocus as we have seen on the website. Now going back to the website, as you can see, the minimum aperture value that you can actually get out of this is around f16 to f32. Okay, the reason being is at 28 millimeters you can go a minimum up to f16, whereas at 200 millimeters you can go up to f32. So what that practically translates is at 28 millimeters this particular lens would function from f2.8 to f16 in terms of aperture value, and at 200 millimeters it would function as f5.6 to f32 aperture value length. In this diagram you can see the 18 elements being put across in 14 different groups. So you have the model glass aspherical elements, you have the hybrid aspherical lenses, you have low dispersion lens elements, you have extra low dispersion elements, all put together 18 elements of glasses. That means 18 glass pieces spread across in 14 different groups. So let's understand the weight and length of this particular lens. So in terms of length, this lens is basically around 117 mm. That means right from here all the way up to here is 117 mm or 4.6 inches, either you try to look at dimensions. And in terms of weight, it's around 575 grams or 20.3 ounces. So this is not a lightweight lens, but for the focal length it's trying to provide, it's an absolute lightweight lens, because at around 500 plus grams you're able to zoom in from 28 millimeters all the way to 200 millimeters if you're having a full frame camera, or roughly around 40-46 mm all the way up to 350 mm if you're having an APC sensor camera like my Sony A6700. So this is how it looks when I'm mounted on my A6700. This is a default configuration which I'm shooting. I always have my LCD monitor out, typically in a slanted configuration, so that I can see easily. I don't use much of the viewfinder unless it's too bright outside, and then start taking photos and videos, right? It's a pretty neat setup. All I need to just basically have this setup. It could either be on a wrist strap, or it could either be on my shoulder mounting clip, which I have from PJY Tech. Because you're not changing any lenses, you're only having one lens, whether you're taking that 44 close to 50 millimeter full frame equivalent photo all the way up to 350 millimeter equivalent photo, you're covering a pretty good decent range there, taking right from portraits to landscape photos to all the way up to zoomed up, particular attractions. So it gives a lot of peace of mind, if you ask me, that the risk of getting dust on my camera sensor is pretty much reduced, very close to zero. But sometimes, you'll never know based on the environment and stuff. It does have an O-ring to weather seal it during its connection with the camera, but dust being dust, it can always find its way through if it would like to. So this is the most versatile combination you can have as a solo content creator. Any of the Sony E-mount cameras, you can use this lens. Full frame, APS-C, even on FX30 you can put on this and start shooting videos, and you'll not change your lens at all. And especially if you're operating from f5.6 of aperture level, even your exposure settings will not change for your scene at all, because you're already at f5.6. At f5.6, nothing is going to happen from an exposure standpoint of view for your image, whether you are at 28 millimeters or all the way up to 200 millimeters. All in all, I would definitely recommend this lens for someone who's looking for a no fuss kind of a lens and camera setup for traveling. Have an A6700, beautiful low light, very good daytime photos. You can swap between photo as well as video mode, and yes, you can also swap to SNQ mode. Now if you do like this video, please go ahead and encourage content creators like me by subscribing to the channel, giving it a like. If you would like to see more content similarly around an A6700 or some sample videos or photos apart from the ones that I've shown to you, go ahead and drop comments below. I'll give you a link to my website. It's free. You can just go ahead and download and try to edit along with them. Please do share in the comments what is your ideal combination for travel photography or travel content making, or what is the other lens and camera body combination that you would actually use from a Sony or a Panasonic or a Fujifilm or a Canon or a Nikon background to take awesome photos and videos while you're traveling or hanging around with your near and dear. Until the next video, take care, stay safe, peace.